to think that a creator can get to the size where they're, like valuing themselves in the what billions, is pretty incredible. And I think he's always just had the ethos of pushing the boundaries and trying to, create bigger ideas.
Before we get into the interview, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Elgato. We've had a lot of great creators on this podcast over the past 10 weeks. And what do they all have in common? An excellent streaming setup. Our friends at Elgato have launched the Wave DX, their first ever XLR microphone. And combined with the Wave XLR audio interface and the Wave mic arms, the Wave DX gives you the opportunity to level up your streaming setup. At a stunning $100 price point, the Wave DX outperforms much of the other microphones in its class. To learn more about the microphone, head over to elgato.com and check out the Wave DX. That's ELGATO.com. Thanks to Elgato for sponsoring this episode, and now back to our interview.
We are joined today by Lester Chen, who is a partner focusing on gaming creators at Andreessen Horowitz, which, if you're unfamiliar, and I'll sort of do the role for people maybe not, Andreessen Horowitz is one of the biggest investment firms in all Silicon Valley. They've invested in a handful of major startups very early in their life cycle. I'm trying to remember the key ones. I think Uber is up there, is one of, not Uber in the portfolio. Yeah, Airbnb, Lyft, yeah, a lot of early investments, and more recently, in the past couple of years, Andreessen Horowitz has become incredibly invested in the cryptocurrency space. One of the leading firms in that space, doing a ton of work there. And then this year, they announced a thing called Games Fund One that had limited partners like the co-founder of Discord, co-founders of Riot Games, co-founders of Blizzard, etc., kind of back behind them, putting money into the pot for them to go invest. And they hired on some people that had previously worked at Riot and elsewhere to lead that fund. And then they had separately hired Lester, who prior to this was working at YouTube. And so Lester's track of the business, as I understand, is focusing more on gaming creators and creator economy, etc. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm still figuring it out, Jacob. So yeah, you tell me. But have been brought to the firm to kind of untangle like everything that revolves around platforms, creators, go-to-market strategies for so many of our portfolio companies that are in development or are near launching their games or companies.
So I think really more broadly, what would be helpful to our audience kind of across all different platforms is defining like what the creator economy is, because I don't think that that's very well defined. It's one of those words that I think is somewhat similar to Web3, but Web3 is an actual technology in most cases. So it's easy to say this is what this is. But, for example, I won't say which, I got reached out to yesterday by an accelerator who was like, we invest in these sectors and the creator economy. And I was like, well, does that mean that you invest in tech that enables creators, so like video editing software, et cetera? Or are you like actually investing in content businesses, the creator economy? So how would you define more presently the creator economy in the sector that you're sort of doing work in?
Yeah, well, I think it's evolved so much over the years. The genesis, I would say, probably started somewhere alongside of video, and like video creation as a means to express oneself and, upload videos to the internet to make money. But I think you could take this in many different directions to, Etsy creators or eBay sellers, or, I think there's so many facets to it. I primarily think about it when asked, like in the realm of, the multi-billion-dollar kind of content streaming space. That's like where I've existed. That's where I kind of like found my career footing early on. And I think over the course of, last decade I think it's most synonymous, at least in my world and in gaming, with content and content creation. And I mean,
it's really interesting
to expand on that. I think, it's kind of a buzzword as of recent, but if you think about like what goes into an economy, and who controls like what really occurs within this ecosystem, like you think about everything, right? Like total money being dished out, total money earned, the amount of participants in the economy, like the number of creators, the different kinds of policies and regulations, and kind of like macro environment to what impacts those those players in the space to make a living or not. I think there's so many different like angles into the world that you can call it like an economy, but at the heart of it, I think, yeah, you got to make money. Like, how do you make money, and how does this thing,
Yep.
how does it like sustain itself, and what is the constant like ebb and flow of participants in the space?
What's really interesting is not that this stuff is particularly new. Like we've had on this show over the past few months, creators who are sort of early to internet video more broadly. We had Hutch on the show, who was kind of the first big gamer on YouTube, right? And was very massively successful, at least in terms of viewership. Obviously, he drilled down about how he kind of got screwed in the monetization side of things. But that was more than a decade ago that someone like him was kind of on top of that world and was popular on YouTube. And I've always thought that gaming was a bigger part of the YouTube sphere all the way from the very beginning. Is when YouTube got popular, gaming was one of its more popular categories. So it's not new, the sort of creator economy, the business around it, but it feels like it's been more formalized as time's gone on. What do you think has changed to get it there, for it to be more formalized as a business, specifically in gaming?
There's many different facets to it. I think like games themselves evolving to, well, it's like hardware and software pretty much, right? Like the hardware to be able to capture content, going from capture cards to just like natively streaming and actually having like tools to be able to capture change, which kind of like spins up a lot of different ways just to record and express oneself on the internet. I think that games themselves kind of changed, just like the free to play model, the games that could have like multiple different outcomes and multiple different ways of like enjoying the game, whether it's creatively or, because like before it was just like let's plays and you could play Call of Duty like Hutch, like, and you could have a million different awesome different like videos come out of that. But I think just like the compounding nature of more games like that, and also a lot more accessible games like, League and then Minecraft and then, and then there's been so many more iterations of the gaming just kind of like industry that's changed, that has then led to more people playing games, easier tools to be able to record and express oneself on a platform like a Twitch or a YouTube, now TikTok. But yeah, I think that formats as well. I think just like actually being able to stream changed a lot of the game, and it changed a lot of the monetization, going from advertising supported long form videos to fan supported streams. And I think like it's yet another arc right now, which is really interesting, of, the fan supported platforms trying to figure out advertising, and a lot of the advertising supported platforms trying to figure out how to better get into fan funding models.
Well, that's like the kind of the peak of where things are at. Obviously, you're referring to Twitch trying to figure out how to get in, to better their advertising model. We've talked about that at length. We had Zach Diaz, who worked at Twitch for some time, on the show a few weeks ago, and he was talking about sort of their issues with advertising more broadly. And we've seen revenue splits change. We've seen them sort of institute this ad incentive program more recently, and also them just start trying to push people to run more ads more broadly, because their ad structure is very funky. And the second part of that, you're referring to your former company, YouTube, I would imagine, who traditionally Google is the king of internet ads more broadly. Their AdSense is a massive business, and now they're trying to, especially as they push more into live streaming, it seems more broadly, get into that more traditional thing that Twitch has done: subscriptions, donations, etc. So
yeah, I think it's with the ethos, I think I've heard Zach or DJ Weed or Devin like talk about this at length. I think they're capturing what is like the spirit of, like, as these new formats pop up, the spirit in which in how you monetize and how the platform needs to adapt often is at odds with like how the business was originally built. And I think it's like those friction points of convincing primarily fan funded creators to then run ads or give them incentives. It's just like so against everything down to the marrow of like how you create and like how you program breaks, or how is this actually good if you're a small creator. But I think like on the flip side, I think we hear a lot about like the Twitch perspective, but I think on the YouTube side, it was always, large YouTube creators didn't want to ask for money at all. Like, you can launch huge membership features or super chats, like just the idea to ask fans that are kind of like contributing to their business through just like watching content and ads it's kind of like a step beyond, like the audience just watches and money comes in, transitioning that to like, oh, you have to make some type of offer, or you have to make, even if the argument could have been like, oh, if you convert 1% of your audience to paying $1, some of the biggest creators are like, no, just like simply not interested. That's not how our business is like grown to be what it is. So it's really, yeah, it I don't know, like the underpinnings of how the platforms are trying to think about new ways to monetize is always going to run into creatively like a point of friction of how the viewers and creators really exist. It's doable, but I think there's like always friction, and it's like, who takes the onus, right? It's like, do you have to create an incentive program? Do you have to do content acquisition? Do you need to better educate folks? But there is kind of this melding now, TikTok doing live, TikTok doing long form, YouTube doing live, YouTube doing shorts, Twitch doing long form or not, Twitch doing clips or not. Like it's a whole kind of like musical chairs of like where content platforms want to exist. I think ideally everything just becomes all formats everywhere all the time, but that might not work very squarely with the creators or audience.
What's interesting about that, specific to YouTube, because you worked at the company during a very integral time to changing up kind of what its offering could be, right? YouTube is I guess TikTok may have this title now, but the most dominant video on demand platform on the internet for a very, very long time, a number of hours watched, and still is massive in that regard. But you and Ryan Wyatt, who now runs Polygon on the game side of things, the blockchain cryptocurrency company, were at the company at a time where they started moving into interactive video more frequently, right? There were reports in 2014 that they were one of the parties Google was one of the parties in the Twitch acquisition talks. Ultimately, I mean, it got to the point where a reporter reported that they were going to buy Twitch, and ultimately they did not. And instead, Amazon bought it. And, more broadly, it seemed like YouTube finally came around to the idea of building its own, which is what it's been doing for the past 6-7 years now. Talk to me a little bit about what that was like more broadly, as much as you can in detail, about sort of pushing YouTube from a feature perspective, a leadership perspective, pushing YouTube into getting into interactive video in the way that it had not before.
Yeah. So funny enough, Ryan and I, when we had spent time at Machinima, it was, I think like I had joined right after Google had invested like a Series A in Machinima back in, I don't know, 2013. And a lot of the work we were doing this is back when like YouTube, you could make custom iframes within a YouTube page. I don't know if anyone listening remembers that.
I remember that.
We had a whole directory, like a Machinima live directory. If you go to youtube.com, it looked like its own Twitch pretty much. And we were working with all the big creators to live stream on YouTube, funny enough. And we were, like the economics of that were so funny. It's like, we're just trying to get eyeballs and make like financially, to your point about creator economy, like sustainable for creators who want to spend their time live streaming. But we're spending, back in that time, like YouTube didn't have transcoding. There was like no chat moderation. There was definitely no like, the equivalent of Twitch subs, which came, like 6 years later in like like 2018 is when memberships was launched on YouTube. It was like many years later, right? So it was like a platform built for the Olympics and the Red Bull space jump. And, after trying to build that into YouTube and consulting and like hopping on phones with like product managers at YouTube, I think like every month to say, hey, that is like, that's not working. Joining YouTube was like a whole different experience. I think gaming was like no doubt huge, right? Like there wouldn't have been, it was like a huge push to verticalize between like kids, music, gaming. But I think a critical component of like an existential question was always, can we be like, the platform for gaming without investing heavily in what essentially was live, right? Can you be synonymous with gaming if you're not like building any kind of effort into live streaming? And that's like where the attention and eyeballs and everything was growing. And to stand up, like we thought really critically about like from the content and like partnership side, like what is the tipping scale? Like, do you just need a lot of like high tier content, or do you need to build? And I think the answer is always, of course, you need to build like products that are, durable and can sustain it. But it was a whole exercise of like mapping what the whole ecosystem was. I remember like one of my first like months or like weeks was Susan, CEO YouTube walking in and being like, okay, so like, how are we going to approach this all? I think my thesis was like esports is this is like esports golden kind of like pre publisher control, let's just call it. And maybe golden is too subjective, but it was like a time in esports where there's a lot of third party content out there, right? Like a lot of people, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of just like interesting stuff going on. So she asked me to map it all out. I was like, oh, holy shit. I have to like tell the, CEO, like what esports is. And I've been at this like big tech platform for 3 weeks, and, you just kind of map out tournament organizers, publishers, whatnot. But that, to get back to your original question, like it all came from a thesis of like, what are people consuming, right? Like, what are people consuming? Oh, people are watching live, and if they're watching live, they're watching esports. Like that's the highest marquee stuff. People are watching really good players, and that's like what makes up, I don't know, like a ton of Twitch. So, what do those creators, I guess, like even if you want to call tournament organizers creators, like what do they need? What do they want? And, if we want to get into that space, like how do you pay to play? How do you build features? How do you make it so that you're not just like inflating even then what was like kind of this idea of like a bubble, of like esports and whatnot. But it was even before like venture capital got in and a lot of other stuff kind of like touched esports. But it is really interesting. That's like one example, right? Of like how you start in live. It's like, you have to identify the addressable market. You have to think about what long-term will make that content thrive and like sustain on the platform if you take away, any amount of money. And then you just go down the list, right? Like, okay, that's very different than for creators. What do creators need? And it's always at the time too, in like 2015, when we first started, it's like live was like, such a minuscule part of the platform. So how do you battle? And like, it never was that YouTube doesn't or didn't care. It was more just like of the million other things, like regulation, battling television, diversifying other, like getting the business into every corner of the world, dealing with like all the just like literal world politics. It was always just I would say just like a great thing that gaming was continuously one of the fastest growing components of the platform. And I think YouTube still continues to have that like wind behind its sails, that like, no matter what, it's like gaming is crushing it. People love gaming. People are consuming gaming content. People are playing gaming content. Now, like, fill in the rest of the blanks of like, how are they expressing themselves on the platform?
Well, what I think people don't understand more broadly about comparing YouTube to Twitch and sort of how the different companies worked is that when YouTube was acquired in the late aughts to go to Google, they very rapidly became a part of the Google ecosystem. And it's part of what made them so successful in the early 2010s as a business, is that they got the ad engine, they got the support on the server side of things, right? Google is a very technically gifted company from an engineering perspective, and it just made the YouTube boat that was already rising just go faster, right? Like it just took it off. Whereas Twitch is very different. Twitch was acquired in 2014 after about 3 years of being live as a platform, 3.5 years of being live as a platform. And it has been, from my reporting, it was left alone from Amazon for a lot of different years, right? There were some technical integrations, obviously, but from a high-level managerial perspective, it was hands-off, right? So that you're fighting two different battles here. Like your group in YouTube was working in a much bigger, I guess, call it more formalized setting, whereas the Twitch group were kind of on their own and able to kind of do whatever they wanted for a period of time while also having the check to do it.
For sometimes better or worse, right? I think like YouTube has a secret weapon, whether or not that, I guess it depends who you ask if it's a secret weapon or not, but just like even content ID systems and the infrastructure to support DVR and the, anywhere in the world, the ability to watch, like streams at a low buffer rate, like everything down to the video codecs to the, like, visual learning cues is state of the art. And I think that is very intentional, but came at the, like, I think it's still like a highly kind of like, we'll see what happens, but just like rights management within live streaming, like co-streaming and the future of like more, traditional media players getting in and how UGC works or like any of that is still pretty, I think it's like advanced at YouTube, but needs to get even more advanced instead of this whole like 100% of revenue goes over to rights holder if they claim. But on, on other platforms, it's just like blunt, get rid of the content, DMCAs and whatnot. So I think that whole, YouTube has had that for so long. And I think that's like going to be a really interesting like macro thing to solve if the maturity of live streaming is to like continue to get more eyeballs, continue to grow. Like that's kind of, I think everyone, YouTube included, needs to figure out how to best do that. But that was like prohibiting a lot of things, right? Streamers wouldn't want to come over to YouTube because they can't play Katy Perry or like click heads and veg out playing an FPS game and just like listen to music, right? That was a huge turnoff to so many folks of like why they would ever want to start on the platform. Like no one wants to risk their YouTube channel by getting a strike or a warning. And I mean, there was a lot of like mysticism, like people didn't even understand the difference between, a content ID claim versus a strike. It was like, the platform has all these different checks and balances that I would say are still, continue to be like really impressive. But at some time when you're trying to push a product or get into a new, business area, can be prohibitive and uncomfortable at times.
Yeah, and for those listening that aren't familiar with the system that Lester's describing, this has existed on YouTube. I remember it in the early 2010s as like a very amateur creator at the time. If you are to use copyrighted content, music is the most obvious of those things. If you were to use copyrighted music, sort of label published music that isn't Creative Commons or open rights, public rights, you have to, if you use that on YouTube, the people that are the owners of that, the record labels in many cases, can claim your content and get all the revenue off of it. And that has been it's part of the reason I think some of those labels like YouTube a little bit more than other platforms is it versus Twitch, whereas the way that works on Twitch now is that if you use copyrighted music, you're not immediately taken down. There have been some cases where that's happened, but more often than not, at least what I see, is they just mute you. Like your video on demand just gets muted when somebody goes back to watch a replay on Twitch. It's not necessarily the, content claimant comes and gets all your money. So yeah, for those unfamiliar, just to explain.
I didn't know this conversation was going to go this way, and I'm sorry we opened up content ID, which is like probably the least sexy topic, but I do think it is integral in like how to talk about the future of a lot of things related to gaming, streaming, content creation, like everything else.
Yeah.
It's just like kind of hidden. I don't know, just like technology that should be talked about a little bit more.
In its own way, it's created its own vertical for music artists too, which is really interesting. I mean, there are a bunch of businesses that have spun up just to be like, we had Mike Darlington on the podcast some weeks ago, and he's the CEO of Monstercat, and they offered like a $10 a month membership or whatever to let people just use their music on whatever, and we won't claim you. We'll let you use the revenue. You just give us credit. And so, it spun up its own business vertical in that way. But to kind of get back to sort of the main topic in the gaming sector is when you started at YouTube, if I remember correctly, your title was specific around esports, and that obviously changed. Or when on your way out, your last one was around creators, which is what you're focused on now, is on the investment side of things. We've talked about this at length on this podcast, and it's sort of the shift of this industry, its attention, its money, etc., moving from competitive gaming, esports, to creators. And there's a billion reasons why that's happening. I would say kind of one of the first among them is that the esports audience size is probably not as big as many people would like to tell you that it is, at least from an actively engaged people that do more than actually watch the games and, go buy merchandise from teams or, go watch content on the side, etc. Also, though, the other part of that is a lot of investors have been burned in esports. Like, there's not really a nice way to say that. We've had a few different team owners on here who's talked about that it's just not economically viable because it's not at scale yet. Gaming creators are, though, and it's interesting that it's growing. I think that something that's really unique, and like I said, we've had Ludwig Ogren on the show who got really popular during the pandemic, Atriarch as well, in the same vein. We saw the rise of a lot of these creators through basically quarantine, because people were, especially on Twitch, because people were being able to connect with these creators on a personal level. Everybody was stuck inside in their houses. Great. Now I can flip on and watch somebody else who's stuck inside in their house creating live content, interact in their chat. Interactive video just grew more broadly. Now it seems like the money is finally shifting that way. I guess from your perspective, probably a little different than mine. Why do you think that is? That the industry is sort of, walking away from esports a little bit more from both audience and investment to more gaming creators more broadly?
Well, I think like esports is always down to the core of even player bases, like the single digit percentage points for the most part of any kind of like games user base, right? I think in the same way content was reflective of that as well. And I think there started being, people just want to watch other people who are really good at something in general. and especially in games, which are for the most part, I mean, this is kind of changing where games are just more of a vehicle for like you can do, I don't know, role playing. You can just get people. It's just becoming the water cooler space. But for a long time, it was like competitive games with ranking systems where you could be really good, and it was just like engineered to spawn really great competitive, you know, leagues and players and whatnot. And it also had this like really, I don't know, thriving feel of you come from a hometown and then you can compete in a greater league and you can be part of a bigger kind of like ability to make money. And that was just like the wave of esports, right? Was just like a feel good, cash flowing in. Like if you wanted to make money as a gamer and you weren't doing content, then you were playing games competitively. And then there was the mixing of you could then do both. You could then stream your content and you could make money from, like I was a former like Halo player and I remember it's laughable. Like I would like, like you could win a national championship and make like 25 grand. And that was like the best, right? At the end of the day. But then when you could actually start streaming and entertaining through just being really good, I think that, that has now like tipped more and more towards, like kind of like the Shrouds and the Terriks and like you start seeing just like the personality becoming mixed with like the skill level becoming like the entertainment product itself, sometimes larger and more appealing than like some of the league play or the like the competitions that they exist in or not, that they depart from. So I think like creators in general, like, yeah, esports was always just like a component. And I think it's a shiny object. I think I still watch, like way too much esports on the weekends.
Yeah.
But from like an investing perspective, you talk about any other creator doing anything else, there's just so many more opportunities. There's like so many more folks that are just playing games, not in a competitive way, and viewers that want to watch them as well.
Well, there's something to be said, and we have a couple different talent agents and managers in this space listening at the moment, and I'm sure that they'll be delighted to hear me say this. There's something to be said about the interactive nature of individual creators versus esports players, right? Like the ability for those creators to connect with the audience in a way, especially in live video, but even in video on demand, to connect with those with their audience in a way that athletes can't, right? Which functionally what esports players cannot do. There are a few people who cross that barrier, but ultimately the esports athletes' sort of goal is to be the best in their respective game. That's practice, practice, practice. Streaming is sometimes a part of that, arrangement, but it's not the same as the creator who flips on the stream and then their sole purpose is to engage, right? And this is why like advertisers love interactive live video and why they like creators a lot, because the return is massive. I think there was a Kickstarter article from Billy Studholm, I believe last week, and it was Devin Nash was quoted as saying that like a PC gaming brand, or PC like creation brand that makes PCs and sells them, had done a sponsorship with an esports team and had gotten like 5 conversions. They did a sponsorship with a creator and in the same amount of time got 1,500 conversions of people actually going to the website and actually buying a PC. Like it's way more interactive versus esports where it's just eyeballs, right? Like that's the only thing you're buying when you buy an esports or esports ad placement, frankly.
Yeah, I think the unit economics are like, I mean, it's always dynamic too. It's even within the esports org structure, the value chain of like, you want to be part of a team, you get kind of like, essentially the benefits of like what a facility, you get marketing, you get the brand, you get the kind of like, you get the pump from the organization, but like oftentimes too, there can be like the superstar effect where the individual becomes bigger than the brand itself. And how do you balance that between selling the esports like brand or team versus like really, is 80% of that viewership or, eyeballs just going to like one specific individual. It's kind of like always in flux.
Yeah, it's changing. And it's really interesting how it's changing too. And there's a broader conversation probably for another time on this show with attorneys about if esports teams are legally agencies, which I think some of them probably are, and how they sell against their creators. But not for another show. Note that one in the back. So I want to talk something newsworthy, Lester, which is Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast it was reported this week in Axios that MrBeast is out in market currently raising $150 million on a $1.5 billion valuation for who knows what. It didn't really say in the report, just kind of his brand. This is his first time, at least presumably in his content, taking outside money that isn't a sponsor. And he's previously, from past reporting, has taken $5 million on a $50 million valuation specifically for Feastables, which is his candy brand that he launched earlier this year to kind of get it off the ground. For those unfamiliar with MrBeast, although I would be surprised if anyone is, he has more than 190 million subscribers across all of his YouTube channels. He has 50 plus million on TikTok. And in the past 3 years, he's expanded from being just a creator to getting into commercial goods. He's launched Mr. Beast Burger, which is a fast food delivery chain. He has started a philanthropic venture because a lot of his content is centered around philanthropy, called Team Trees, which he said the other day has planted more than 20 million trees over the past 3 years. And then, as I mentioned, he launched Feastables, which is a candy brand that's got distribution in Walmart and a few other major selling points as well. His management company, who also are doing investments of their own, have raised $100 million earlier this year from the Chen Group, or an investment group who have invested in the likes of Barstool Sports, Otter Media, who own Rooster Teeth, although they later spun that out, and the Action Network, which is a sports gambling news website. I guess I want to talk about this a little bit more broadly, but I want to ask sort of your high level thoughts of what you think about MrBeast out there raising $150 million and, one, a bad economy, and two, but at a time where like he's the apple of every person's eye. I mean, his popularity is massive.
Yeah, I think it's more exemplary of just kind of like how high the ceiling has gotten for, I guess, like, I think of him more as an entrepreneur than necessarily at this point than just like a content creator. But I like, in order to contextualize, these endeavors, you have to just think about, man, like how crazy is it that I think the coolest thing you could probably do in like 2015 as a YouTube creator is like show up on a late night show, or maybe have your own like merch business, or run a Minecraft server, like to think that, a creator can get to the size where they're, like valuing themselves in the billions, is pretty incredible. And I think he's always just had the ethos of pushing the boundaries and trying to, create bigger ideas. And I think that whether this is like consumer packaged goods, this is other endeavors outside of, I don't know, just like his normal content, it just shows the, it's just very unique because he is just ambitious. Like there are a ton of creators that are making, tens of millions of dollars just through ad rev, but very few of them want to expand their businesses to actually build out like these functional new ventures. So I think like you have to look at it, and I don't know what a comparison is. I don't work in the like other celebrity musician fields where they break off and do their own endeavors. But at the end of the day, I think the flipping of taking brand and commercial deals to creating products yourselves where you have stake and equity and like really, attach your brand to it. It's like he has the microphone right now. And what do you command with that microphone? And like, where does it actually tie into the DNA of what he already does from a content perspective is like kind of a question. Is it candy? What's the extent that you can take that? Could he do a shoe? Yeah. Could he build a business that has a higher market cap than a Nike? Could he beat out a handful of fast food chains? I think the answer to some of these is probably yes. But I think it's all anchored on everything you mentioned in the kind of blurb for him, right? It all comes from an audience somewhere on a platform. At the end of the day, his value, what he's making is, probably disproportionately now like becoming less and less just reliant on the platforms. But I think it is a move he can make from just growing alongside this like billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industry, which is video creation. And now it's like, okay, he's extracted. He has like multiple channels, right? He has a whole team. It's like, where else, like what else can you milk out of the existing platforms where it's like the attention economy? It's like he's capitalized on every, like everywhere. You could touch any platform and get it, right? Like even his long form content initially was made for short form before short form. And, like you could take any of his tonality, the tempo, everything. It's like made for where the future was, pretty much, very like isolated, clickable. You want to watch what happens. So he just made that seamless transition. I think, yeah, when you capitalize on the attention economy, if you want to call it that, like where else do you go? Well, you can splinter off your business and do like a million different things. And I think that's kind of what he's trying to do in this motion.
Well, he's doing what Ninja didn't ultimately, in my opinion. Ninja sort of also had this like very massive viral fame moment in 2018 where he became one of the biggest creators in the world and certainly the biggest creator in all of gaming. And that parlayed into partnerships, right? With things like Adidas, etc. Now more recently Masterclass. But Ninja didn't necessarily break off and build kind of these other things that he owned. He was lending his brand and his recognition to other sizable brands, a la Adidas, Masterclass, etc. Mr. Beast is taking that step further of, I own this. This is me, right? And that's something that is really intriguing. It's something we've not seen. We've seen in content creation and more broadly, like you mentioned, celebrities, etc. Sort of using that parlay. That's not new. Like Kevin Durant, LeBron James have done that to a certain extent. People like why am I forgetting her name? Reese Witherspoon has done that more recently with Hello Sunshine, turning into a production company, right? Like using their sort of fame, reputation, etc., to flip into enterprise. But he's doing this in a space, especially among young creators, that others haven't. And so I think that's why I'm particularly interested. But I do want to ask, especially now that you're sort of, you were in his world and the YouTube world in terms of live video or not live video creation, but video creation and sort of video marketing, etc. I would say listening to his manager, Reed Desher, who I know personally and think is a good person, to clarify, because I'm about to be slightly critical, to listen to what the Mr. Beast camp has said about the way that they operate their business in the past, and I'm sure this gets alleviated with capital, is the immediate, like me knowing the venture capital industry, red flag, which is they've talked about more broadly having issues with sort of runway and with having to go leverage their assets, whatever that may be, future YouTube monetization, etc. Going back to brands that they're already in contract with to ask for additional money because they're just running out of money, right? Sort of overshooting their coverage with whatever budget they have to work on things. And if that wasn't Mr. Beast, I would think it's fair to say that most venture capitalists would stay the fuck away from this, because it is, if that's what they're going to use the capital for, because that alone is like something. And not to mention, and I want to cover this a little bit too, is that venture capitalists don't traditionally like content unless it's very much what they're focused on. It's a business that has lower valuations, meaning it's not as high value. More broadly, its revenues are sort of wonky. Creating monthly recurring revenue in content is really tough, or at least stable monthly recurring revenue. The switch can go off, something can change. In the media business, Google can change part of their algorithm and things, kind of go up and down. It's not consistent like a tech company. And so it's already a content spear, but, I've paid attention to LinkedIn the past 2 days, and it's just VCs like fawning over the opportunity to even look at this more broadly. So I guess, like, do you think the name is just going to push him through to raising this money?
Yeah, I'm not going to really talk about like the investing side too much, or like our like I'll speak in more like platitudes. And I think that you just have to really get specific about the businesses that he is probably trying to grow into. Like, is it a consumer packaged good, company? Is it an automotive company? Is it a whatever? I think like that is first and foremost kind of the first principle that you have to evaluate. Like, could those return venture sized, are those venture sized businesses? Like, there's probably bloody waters everywhere. If it's like a water company or whatnot, like what is the edge? And then when you talk about specifically like content creators, who knows what the future looks like? It is interesting, but if you think about content creators, their income is shared amongst a handful of big tech platforms. It's not the technology itself. So like what actually will have like a crazy network? Like he's kind of the built-in marketing, which I think is super powerful in the whole reversal of the business, right? It's like he has the marketing plan, the content, everything on lock, which sometimes is the hardest part for all these brands to get into. And they need to pay to get, it's like the whole user acquisition model. He's like on the complete opposite side trying to productize. So I think like it's like the history book is still probably being written as to like what functions of his expansion will be successful, but like being, very specific, like look at what those products are and, what among those sectors actually turn into become like $1 billion businesses. And did they build to like, were they built to become billion-dollar business because of the marketing plan?
Yeah, I'll be really intrigued to see where that money goes, because if that just, I don't think all of it's going to go to content. I'm sure it will go to some sort of vertical expansion into something, or horizontal expansion into something else not related to content, as he's already done. But more broadly, I'll be very, very intrigued to see the way that they talk about content spending publicly, because previously it, again, raised some red flags if you're a traditional content venture capitalist.
I mean, at the end of the day, like I think, like I almost back up and just think about the amount of money that is just like being generated on platforms for content creators, and to provide the ability to be able to like pivot your business into really ambitious things, right? You look at like the Dude Perfect facility, or it's like you would never have dreamed that like as a content creator that you could get to a point where you're making, 8 figures and getting into a position where, or 9 figures and getting into a position where the content you uploaded of whatever, slice of life you were passionate about could get you to a place of like expanding into the areas that you are now, right? That was like traditionally just not on the table. And within the course of a decade, like I think that in itself is just impressive, whether or not you talk about the viability of, how viable it is for a venture, to be like VC backed.
I'll be intrigued to kind of see who is on that, who, when that raise is announced, who sort of fronted the cash on it. And you'll be hearing from me if it's you, which I don't expect you to talk about, but be surprised if you don't get a phone call already. So I want to quote Ludwig Ogren on this show some weeks ago, and spin it into a broader question to you and the work that you're doing now. This is the quote. VCs,
I saw this. I think I saw
yes. VCs are dumb as fuck, bro. You talk to a VC and they only know Mr. Beast. You have to explain what a Twitch streamer is through only Mr. Beast and Ninja, which is crazy. It's like trying to draw the Mona Lisa with crayons. Close quote. Obviously, you come from the creator world, and are now at one of the bigger venture capital firms in Silicon Valley and San Francisco.
I'd like to deal with Ludwig.
Exactly right. So you're educated on here. That I don't think that was the shot at you. However, I totally hear what he's saying more broadly about the ecosystem, because I want to spin that into the question of, in the work that you're doing, especially because venture capital and private equity can lag behind, how do you think is the best way to educate these investors who are trying to figure out this new world that basically you are from and live in, the sort of gaming creators more broadly, and the investment opportunities that exist?
Yeah, I mean, there's like so many different angles, right? Like one is working with, so a lot of my time that I spend is working with some of like our founders and our companies to really understand community, content, what platforms to be on, how those platforms work first off, before you can really talk about how to work with creators and really what you want to get out of it. And then, because then it immediately goes into like, well, why would a creator want to spend their time or take your deal, or to like, essentially get into a risk prone situation to, it's like, if a game or a product isn't as aligned with what the creator's doing, then they're just going to ask for a lot more money, or they're just going to like, it's off the table. So how do you like get in and play in that space first off? But then how do you also build it from within? Like what functions within let's just say a game should you be mindful of that can lead to content creation, or what do you have to do yourself as a company to show that like, you're putting content out there to kind of like build the behavior of a future content creator that's just playing your game but never thinking about like creation. So that's like half the kind of like story, I guess. And then when I mean, I think it's just probably because like what Ludwig said, it's like it's super complicated. There's tens of thousands of monetizing creators in this space, like to figure out who's playing what, how like an individual's making money, what platforms they're on. It's like there's so many influencer marketing like middleware. They're just like combining metrics, saying, oh, like, just like mushing TikTok viewership with Twitch followership with YouTube followership. So like if you're an outsider, you don't really know, I don't know, the act of creation or the kind of like what it means to, be a full-time content creator. You're just going to only look at the top line metrics and make like inferences of how to work with that entire world. And I think that's probably where he gets like a lot of the sensations. But at the same time, from a company perspective, like new companies building, I don't know, platforms that support creators. I think I had the privilege or benefit of being at such a sophisticated like YouTube platform that could see so many different, I don't know, facets of how to make money, how to enact policy, how to attract advertisers, how to build functions. And you see like the whole thing, like you see the whole, every pitfall that's been kind of like mulled over and considered and like rejiggered. And especially how that affects like the creators of that platform. So yeah, I think like, unless you've been on the operating side and has been kind of like in the weeds, it's like really easy to only see creators from the outside in and look at charts of like combined cumulative viewership and I don't know, and just have no idea how to even approach those conversations.
Yeah, well, this is why you make a good hire to be in this particular space, having that subject knowledge expertise. To the other VC and PE firms that listen to this podcast, which I know there are a few, hire under 30s that have MBAs. There's your answer. People that understand business and also like watch TikTok and YouTube and actually consume the content. Stop trying to coin flip, because I'm sure that will not go well. I do want to ask, before we get into audience questions, so we have a few that I want to give the opportunity to speak. One last thing. Some of the companies that are in that creator space already, as the platforms in particular, and then also people like game publishers, they do have investment platforms, right? Like Google Ventures is a thing on the side of, its sister to YouTube. Amazon has its own personal investment arms as well. People like Riot, people like Blizzard also have to do these things, but we haven't seen any of them sort of dip their toe directly. Maybe they've contributed to a fund that does creator investments, but we haven't seen them personally dip their toe into that. Do you see there a world where the platforms that have all of this unique insight into the industry, in the case of places like YouTube, making those investments themselves past sort of the partnership deals that they're doing currently?
Yeah, potentially. I think at the end of the day, it's like, what can they offer if everyone has like capital? Like it's all strategic, right? Like who would take that money and for what reason? I think is kind of the question you should be asking. Whether it's like publisher money or big tech money or venture money, I think that's like where, well, I mean, like, yeah, money isn't always flowing, but I think like once you take a check, you want to know that whatever strategic you're working with can bring in experts in different areas, right? Like the team right now is kind of assembled in a way where we have like expertise across the board, like how to hire people, how to build content strategies, how to work a publisher deal, how to, like crosses the whole gamut of people that come from either game companies or tech companies that are like experts in helping the person with an idea or the handful of people that have an idea, but just don't have expertise in a lot of actual company building or community building or publishing deal, So I think like, there's a lot of great things happening within a Riot or within a Google, but it's really about the founder who like where do they need the most value is more the question. So if you're a game company, you probably have great ability to play test or QA or bring in, a lot of the metrics about, you could tell a game designer so much about the in-house stuff that but, do you have components of have you seen hundreds of startups come and go and know how to build a great company with like a great community or let's say Twitch or YouTube strategy or TikTok strategy? Like it's probably like one of those like character select charts where there's like strengths and weaknesses across the board. And just kind of assuming that money will be there and that can be deployed in a strategic way for that company.
Yeah.
And how many bets some of these folks are taking at a time too, right? Like I think a lot of, yeah. I think there's like always different amount of volume of checks that go out and I'm still learning. Obviously, I think any games investing is so new, but I think that, I mean, there's so many things to consider. While like, if you're a founder taking.
Yeah, I think sort of broadly across this entire conversation, what's really interested me about this is a space that is so untraditional for investment, especially on the creator side of things. Like it is, like I mentioned, it's content, which is traditionally not a very valuable venture capital investment space. It's something that a lot of people shy away from. It's gaming. It's an entire brand new sector. Like you said, it's an incredibly dense sector to like figure out kind of who's who and what's most relevant, right? And who has the good business strategy, because a lot of these creators are very successful but have no business acumen. It's incredibly hard to decipher, and that's why I like wanted to kind of have this conversation, because it is, to me, it's still not quite figured out, right? We're not at a space where a lot of these companies can truly identify what's most relevant.
I think a next evolution that'll be really interesting and kind of what I'm trying to manifest into the future is, like who is going to be from an investor standpoint. And maybe this is Ludwig, maybe it's someone else. Like how do creators get savvier about investing? Like definitely a ton of huge creators that have generated capital have already, it's like angel invested across a handful of companies, but how do we attract more and more of folks that are like gaming native creators that have enough capital that have like risen up through, the gaming industry, not as a designer, not on the studio side, but have, capital or some type of desire to invest back into the industry. And as like a byproduct of that, like helping advise companies, helping, actually be more integrated into the whole process of development, right? Because I think right now, a lot of the flow is like commercially based, like, oh, games launching, just get a bunch of streamers and stream something and hashtag sponsored, hashtag ad. But who's teaching creators who are optimizing so much for the short term of like taking, a brand deal or taking a, 10, 20, 30, 50, $100,000 check to do this, that, and whatever. That's like always flowing to slow down and think about like longer money, how to actually like invest, how to like actually feed back into the games, hopefully like the future games that they'll love. I think you're starting to see a little bit of it. And I think that's like the really, a really exciting part of the space right now as, I think the whole publishing model, there's like so much, like, I think the most exciting part about games right now is like there's so much undercurrent that's changing the publishing model, the creator space, like right now we're kind of in a games drought. Like what is the next evolution of the kinds of games that we're going to see that are, born from either new technology or just like great new studios of executive producers falling, like starting their own things. I think like we're on the cusp of, I think it's going to be a really, really awesome, really interesting, like next few years in games. But we've been in this like little, I would say kind of a recession, in like, I think 2020 and 2021, I mean, for all the bad stuff that was happening in the world, like games saw so much crazy amounts of success and like awesome stuff. But now it's kind of like this hangover period where everything is, pulling back, like ad dollars, number. If you look at all the, like every metric, right? Number of creators, number of streamers, watch time is flat. I think we're in line of where we would naturally be growing pre-COVID, accelerated growth. That was probably like 3 times as large as what any of the platforms would have normally have seen, where like Twitch grew like 60%. Like that was nuts. Like Twitch was growing like 15%, 20%, 25%, like, steady and impressive. But then it was like a crazy, as far as watch time goes, like crazy years, crazy sustained years. Now it's like regressing a little bit. So I think, I think there's like so many interesting things happening from development, from technology, from like the creator space that like the games we'll see in the next few years, I get really excited about.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of like sober up in some spots and then sort of figure out the next ones. And that's what I've been feeling sort of the past 6 months is the peel back where things got a little too overhyped and then sort of figure out where you go forward. It's correctional period, which is good. I think that's a good thing more broadly for the games industry. So we'll take our first audience question, which is from Chris Kovalik, Kago, who is returning listener and has previously asked questions in previous spaces. Sammy, if you want to throw him an invite to speak.
The question I have is on the nature of esports, where we are in the maturity cycle of esports. And my question is, do you think that esports is going to have a chess moment, which I'm defining as, a moment where there's an international fervor, there's a lot of nationalistic pride around the players, kind of like what was happening in chess, a few decades ago? And do you think that esports will have a golf moment where it's the dignified business person's hobby? What would happen if heads of state or president of the United States ends up loving to play League of Legends or something like that? Do you see those moments happening? Do you think that they'll, when do you see them coming? And if so, what do you think it would mean for esports as a whole?
So I'll admit, I don't know, like if you were to ask me 2 areas of like sport or like, I don't know chess or golf that well to pick up and feed off of those analogies, but I know a little bit about kind of what you're talking about. I think like esports will probably be a mixture of it's an like I think I think like Jacob, you'll probably agree with this. A lot of what esports did and is doing is kind of unique in its own. The global nature of the audience, like kind of like way people play ever evolving games, and how like the power struggle has kind of like shifted from independent to publisher owned. Like I think that is still like we're still seeing. There's maybe a few more layers to be seen of like how that actually like builds and sustains over time, because you have to like almost think like that to think about your question, right? Like, is this going to be nationalistic? Is this going to be, I forget your golf analogy, but I think that's just like kind of where I would try to focus. I think the way that the leagues and, the money is flowing right now is, it's, I guess like like if you look at League, I watch a ton of League and I watch a ton of Valorant, so I'm probably biased here, but like you do see some of the way it's organized, like lead to some national, like you see some of these like you just watched Loud win the VCT stuff, and I think there's pockets that are kind of being unlocked, but it's also, I think the accessibility of games too, and like if you think about esports as this global force and where like player bases can actually exist, it's like not completely egalitarian right now. Right, like you don't have like, even though there might be a huge like Valorant audience in India, there might not actually be accessibility to play that game. So you might see like dispersion in like where viewership comes from, and then advertising is always going to be trailing in that space. And so I think like if you think about the business of it all, you'll probably see glimpses of, I'm guessing, a mixture of golf and chess to some degree.
I think the one thing I would add about the nationalism side is I think it already exists to a certain extent. I think that, when you watch something like the League of Legends World Championship, that you see sort of rooting interests based off of country and location. Problem is that, to me at least, that's not at scale, especially in the Western world. And there's a lot of factors for that. I think that a lot of the multiplayer games have significant issues with accessibility in the Western world, whether that be because broadband. I read a piece like a few months ago for my Substack about like what issues exist and how expensive it is to have 25 megabytes a second download speed in parts of the country, $100+ in a lot of places, which is really unaffordable. And so it makes especially PC gaming inaccessible. And then the PCs themselves are really pricey, right? Or like generally very pricey to get into these games. So like we're just not at a big enough player scale in the Western world and parts of Europe and parts of America to truly bring that out. I think that does actually exist in some significant scale in the Eastern world, in China, South Korea, etc., because there are means there, right? Like there's significant broadband access in China in a way that there is not here in America. And then in Korea, when I visited there 4 years ago, there was a PC cafe like every half block, or like every half mile. It was incredibly easily accessible to go in somewhere and pay the equivalent of $5 and right there you're in a game of League of Legends or whatever you might want to be. That doesn't exist here. And I think that there's a broader issue with accessibility that is holding esports back in America.
I also think I take the angle too of like, we are talking about the AAA esports stuff, or like esports leagues and audiences and players. But if you look at, like a lot of what we saw at YouTube was like where we were winning a lot from live was like all of the Free Fire activity that sometimes exceeded a lot of even the League of Legends viewership. And if you look back even a week, Mobile Legends Bang Bang had their MPL like tournament, and that like viewership was like 1.7 million viewers in its peak. I believe. I still kind of like I'm trying to keep tabs on it, but like incredibly impressive. So in a very like tribal nature, there can be some games that are very specific to like Indonesia or Southeast Asia that in the overall tapestry of esports can still be thriving and have its own little like place. When you talk about like certain titles that then have global nature, like a League or a Valorant, or that's when you have to start getting into like the accessibility and like how we think some of those things will evolve.
I hope mobile games break this wall, though. Mobile competitive games in particular break this wall, because at least in the Eastern world, they already started to have, as you mentioned, like more broadly. I remember when PUBG Mobile came out, it was super dense in China by player base because you could play it on public transit, etc. Like, and certain parts of the U.S., like New York, you can't even get cell service when you're underground in a subway. So, like, we're so far behind from that perspective. And, but I do think mobile esports has got a broader, wider future, and maybe kind of eventually taps this in the sense of like having a phone that can play one of these games is way easier than having a PC to play one. For example, it's just barrier to entry is so much lower socioeconomically.
Thanks for watching Visionaries on YouTube. For more content, please subscribe to the Overcome channel.